Move it or lose it. The words cut through the morning air like a blade, sharp, dismissive, final. Officer Miller didn't yell, but he didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of unbending authority. He stood tall, uniform pressed, mirrored shades hiding his eyes, but not the smirk tugging at the edge of his mouth. The sun had just started to burn through the early haze on the edge of the industrial district when he spotted the battered blue van, half a tire over a cracked yellow curb. One look at the peeling registration sticker and the slight lean of the camper was all it took for him to decide. It didn't belong here. He didn't see the man stepping out slowly, gripping a worn walker with white-knuckled hands. He saw a problem, a ticket, a task to complete. Sergeant David Jones, Davy to those who knew him, moved with effort, each motion stiff with the ache of old injuries and years spent living where no one could see him. 71 years old and still standing tall, or as tall as his back would allow, he squinted at the young officer who had just given him 10 minutes to move his only possession of value. He wasn't just being asked to relocate a vehicle, he was being threatened with the loss of his entire life. That van was more than metal and rubber. It was his shelter, his identity, the last shred of stability left to him in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. "Officer, please," he began, his voice a rasp of gravel and time, his words deliberate, laced with fatigue. "I'm working with the VA. The registration's delayed, but it's in progress. This is my home. I'm not trying to break the law, I just have nowhere else to go." But Miller didn't flinch. He tapped his citation pad like a metronome, counting down the minutes with no hint of compassion. 10 minutes, old man. That's the deal." Davy looked down at his hands, fingers calloused from decades of labor, now shaking with helplessness. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He'd faced down worse than this. Combat zones, freezing nights in the mountains, endless patrols through jungle terrain. But nothing made a man feel smaller than standing powerless before a person who wouldn't see you. Not as a soldier, not as a human, just as a problem to be removed. The van behind him, his van, was more than just a rust-specked camper clinging to road life. It was the Wanderer, a name scrawled years ago in permanent marker just above the rear bumper, faded now, but still legible. To anyone else, it might have looked like an eyesore, but to Davy, it was the last place on earth that felt like it belonged to him. He had outfitted it with care. A shelf of books, salvaged from second-hand stores, a tiny fold-down table that still held his morning thermos, and a photo frame that never left its spot, his daughter's smile frozen in time. He talked to that photo every night, told her about his day, told her he missed her, told her he was still trying. Inside, things were kept orderly, not because he had to, but because that's how he was trained. The sleeping bag was always folded after use, the boots always polished, even the tiny gas stove wiped clean. A Marine doesn't stop being a Marine just because the world stops watching. He lived off a small disability check, his benefits tangled in red tape that no amount of polite inquiry seemed able to cut. Gas was a luxury. Food was simpler than it should be. The city's vehicle fees had ballooned beyond reason. Each month he tried to save enough to get the registration caught up. Each month something else needed fixing. The battery, the brakes, the heater. There was always something. He parked in quiet places, industrial lots no one cared about. He cleaned up after himself, never made noise, always tried to stay invisible. But today his invisibility had failed him, and now he had 8 minutes left before everything he owned would be loaded onto a tow truck and disappeared into a bureaucratic maze he'd never escape. He couldn't move the van. The starter had been acting up for days. The battery barely held a charge, and even if he could move it, to where? He turned back toward Officer Miller, who stood with crossed arms, checking his watch like a man timing a game. No acknowledgement of Davy's record, no thanks for the service, no patience. Just the ticking clock. The city didn't see Davy. It saw a violation, and the law, in its blind pursuit of order, didn't care what it destroyed along the way. And that was the moment Davy realized something he hadn't wanted to admit before. He was truly, deeply alone. Officer Miller considered himself efficient. He didn't see the world in grey. To him, things were either lawful or unlawful, in order or out of order. That mindset had earned him praise in the academy, and later in the precinct where older cops grumbled about paperwork and public pushback. Miller thrived on it. He liked the rules. Rules didn't argue. Rules didn't ask for your story. They didn't care if you were late on rent or if your kid needed medicine or if, like Davy Jones, your home was 4 wheels away from being ripped off the pavement. Rules, he believed, were the great equalizer. No one was above them, not even a worn-down Marine with shaky hands and expired tags. He stood next to the camper like a judge at a sentencing. The van, sun-bleached and weary, looked as tired as the man inside it, and yet Miller didn't waver. He tapped on the ticket writer, cold digits forming against the screen. City ordinance this, violation that. It didn't matter how many medals the man might have earned in a younger, stronger body. Those details weren't printed on a windshield. What Miller saw was a civic nuisance, a vehicle that didn't belong, paperwork that wasn't filed, and a man who hadn't done what was required. Never mind the fact that Davy had made more sacrifices before Miller was even born. To Miller, the only thing that mattered was that Davy had broken the rules, and people who broke the rules needed to be corrected. When Davy tried to explain again, more softly this time, less hopeful, Miller interrupted. He pointed to a worn parking sign leaning at an angle. No parking 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. It didn't matter that it was well past morning. It didn't matter that the curb was cracked and forgotten, in a part of the city no one cared about until someone decided they needed it clear. You're in violation. This van's getting towed unless you move it. There was no malice in his voice. But there was no compassion either. It was the kind of tone people used when they wanted to get through something quickly, without consequence, without guilt, as though empathy would slow things down. Davy nodded slightly, more from habit than understanding. His stomach was turning cold. His hands, stiff and dry, reached for the citations. He looked at them but didn't read them. He didn't need to. They said the same thing as every notice that had arrived in the mail over the past year. You failed. Pay up or be removed. He had nowhere to go, no backup plan, no storage unit waiting to house his things, no apartment to retreat to. Just a van with a sputtering engine and the scent of old coffee and clean laundry that he'd scrubbed in public sinks. He watched Miller back up a few steps, arms crossed, tapping his boot heel against the sidewalk like he was counting down seconds. Davy sat back on the low curb, slow and unsure, his breath shallow. The engine wouldn't start, not with how it had been behaving. The battery had been drained last night from the cold, and he had been trying to conserve what little charge he had left in case he needed to call the VA. A tow truck would be a death sentence to his freedom. And impound fees? That was a cost Davy couldn't even joke about. They'd gut what was left of his savings. He might never see the van again. He might lose everything, his photos, his books, his medals, his boots. He blinked down at his old flip phone. It was so outdated that even the local library Wi-Fi couldn't reach it. There were no apps, no emails, just a few numbers stored. Most of the people in there were gone, either moved, disconnected, or passed on. All except one. A number labeled simply Kane. He hadn't looked at that contact in years. He didn't even know if it still worked. It had been a long time since General Alistair Kane had barked out orders in the field. A long time since Davy had called anyone Sir. But Kane had made him a promise years ago, at a funeral for another Marine. A promise said with firm eyes and a clasped handshake. If the world fails you, call me. Doesn't matter what time. Doesn't matter why. He had never dared to. It felt like crossing a line, using that connection. Davy didn't like feeling like a burden. Marines didn't beg. But this wasn't about pride anymore. This was about survival. His thumb hovered over the call button, hesitating. What if the number was dead? What if Kane didn't remember? What if this was the final humiliation, reaching out and getting nothing back? But then he looked at the tow citation in his lap and he knew. There was no more room for doubt. It was now or never. The screen flickered to life. He pressed call. The line clicked. 1 ring, 2, static, 3. And then, an unmistakable voice, gravel-lined and commanding even through the phone. This is Kane. Davy felt his throat tighten. The words came slowly, almost inaudibly. General Kane, sir. This is Sergeant David Jones. We served together. 2nd Battalion. You said, if I was ever in a tight spot. There was silence, then a pause, and something changed in the air around that voice. Jones? Kane repeated, suddenly more alert, like muscle memory had kicked in. Where are you, Sergeant? Davy swallowed. Industrial Way, corner of Sycamore. Officers here. Wants to tow my van. It's my home. I'm trying to get the tags fixed, but I've got about 4 minutes left. A breath, then steel. Understood. Hold your position. We're rerouting now. Help is coming. Davy stared at the screen as the call ended. For a moment he thought maybe the whole thing had been in his head, that the voice had been a memory, not a promise. But then he heard it, the faintest tremor in the distance, a sound he hadn't heard in years. Heavy diesel engines, low, powerful, undeniable, getting closer. General Alistair Kane was not the kind of man who used words lightly. He had built a career on precision, on swift action, on knowing when to speak and when to move. And when he said, "Hold your position," it wasn't a polite suggestion, it was an order, a promise wrapped in command. As soon as the call ended, Kane didn't waste a second. He stood up inside the lead vehicle of a National Guard inspection tour he'd been overseeing, a convoy rolling through nearby facilities on a schedule that had just been irrevocably changed. He gave a few clipped instructions, coordinates, street names. "We're rerouting, priority response, block Sycamore and Industrial, full presence. I'll explain on arrival." No hesitation, no debate. He didn't say why. He didn't have to. The men in the convoy knew Kane's voice and they trusted it. When the general says move, you move. Meanwhile, back on the cracked curb of Industrial Way, Davy stared at the phone in his palm, unsure what to feel. He was too old and too tired to believe in miracles anymore. But something in Kane's voice had stirred a spark he hadn't felt in years, certainty. Not hope, not blind optimism, certainty, the kind you could march behind, the kind you'd follow into fire. And it steadied him, if only a little. He tucked the phone back into his coat, exhaled slowly, and looked at the van. The Wanderer wasn't going anywhere on its own, but maybe, just maybe, it didn't have to. Officer Miller was still checking his watch, glancing up the road every minute like a kid waiting for the ice cream truck. Except he wasn't expecting sweetness. He was expecting the tow. And when he finally spoke again, his voice was practically smug. "You've got about 2 minutes left. Hope you've made peace with your van." Davy didn't respond. He wasn't ignoring him. He just didn't have anything left to say. What was the point? The clock was ticking, and the law didn't care about explanations. It didn't matter that he'd once carried a wounded man 3 miles under fire, or that he'd spent decades trying to live quietly with dignity. None of that mattered to a citation printer and a deadline. But then something changed. At first, it was a vibration in the ground, so subtle it could have been mistaken for a passing truck or distant construction. But then came the sound. A low, slow rumble that didn't sound like any city vehicle. It was deeper, more deliberate. It had weight, momentum. Davy's ears perked up. He knew that sound. That wasn't a garbage truck. That wasn't a delivery van. That was military. And not just any military vehicle. This was armor, reinforced diesel engines in sync, tires built to survive IEDs, and the sound was growing louder. Miller frowned, trying to pinpoint the source. His smirk faltered. He turned toward the end of the block, expecting to see the tow truck. But what appeared around the corner wasn't a civilian vehicle. It was something altogether different. First came the hulking frame of an MRAP, mine-resistant, ambush-protected. It turned onto the street with the steady confidence of something that knew it didn't need permission. Its thick armor plates caught the light, its turret housing unmanned but unmistakably there. Then came the next vehicle, another MRAP, then 3 olive-drab Humvees. They moved in formation, not speeding but not slowing either. Their presence didn't ask for clearance, it commanded it. The convoy wasn't here for show, it wasn't for drills or photo ops. It had been redirected for one purpose, and it made that purpose immediately clear. The first MRAP rolled to a stop and blocked the intersection behind Davy's van. The second sealed off the far end. The Humvees formed a wall across the middle of the block. The city was still waking up. A few early commuters stared in stunned silence from behind steering wheels, unsure if they were witnessing a drill, a raid, or the beginning of something far more serious. Officer Miller stepped back, startled. His authority, moments ago so absolute, now felt microscopic. He turned to Davy, searching for answers, but the old Marine wasn't looking at him. He was staring straight ahead as the final Humvee eased up beside the Wanderer. The passenger door swung open before the wheels stopped moving. Out stepped a man with silver hair and posture like carved stone, civilian clothes pressed and clean, but every inch of him radiated command. Kane. He didn't waste time surveying the scene. He didn't need to. His eyes passed briefly over Officer Miller, then locked on Davy. "Sergeant Jones," he called in that parade ground voice that didn't rise but still silenced everything. "Good to see you, Marine." Davy stood slowly, heart pounding not from fear but disbelief. He hadn't seen Kane in years, yet the man looked like he could still run a field op before lunch. "General," he said quietly, unsure if it was real. But Kane reached out, gripped Davy's arm, and pulled him up with strength that seemed to defy age. "I wish it were under better circumstances," he said, and there was no pity in his voice, just resolve. Miller finally found his voice. "Hey, you can't just shut down a city street. Who are you people? This is a police matter." Kane turned toward him slowly. His gaze was like ice, thawed in fury. "Officer, I am General Alastair Kane, United States Marine Corps, retired. This man," he gestured to Davy, "is Sergeant David Jones, a Marine, a decorated combat veteran. This," he said, stepping closer with unmistakable weight in his voice, "is no longer a matter of parking violations. This is now a military support response to a systemic failure." The street fell into a stunned silence, pierced only by the idling hum of diesel engines. Miller's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The general didn't need to say more. His presence said it all. And for the first time in years, Davy didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel like a case number or a code violation. He felt seen, heard, backed. The cavalry hadn't just come. It had arrived. The tension on Industrial Way had shifted in a way you could almost feel in your chest. Just moments ago, Officer Miller had been the only authority on the street. Now, he looked like a rookie caught in the wrong room at the wrong time. General Alastair Kane didn't need to raise his voice or pound his chest. He was the kind of leader who carried authority in his posture, in his silence, in the way every Marine in that convoy stood a little taller just because he was there. As he faced the young officer, his words landed like sledgehammers. "This man is a decorated combat veteran. This is no longer a question of expired tags. This is about what kind of country we are when we let our heroes fall through the cracks." Officer Miller, trying to hold on to some semblance of protocol, raised his hand with a faltering gesture towards the parked van. "Sir, with respect, this vehicle is parked illegally and the registration is expired. I was following standard city procedure." He spoke slower now, the confidence in his voice thinning like air on a mountaintop. It wasn't defiance anymore, it was confusion, disorientation. Miller had expected a routine citation, not a battlefield of principles. General Kane didn't flinch. "Your procedure is why we're here, officer," he said, each word deliberate, each syllable landing with surgical precision. "You saw an old van and an older man and decided it wasn't your problem. You didn't ask if he was a vet. You didn't try to contact veteran services. You didn't exercise discretion. You saw an easy tow and you acted on it. You followed rules without understanding purpose. That's not law enforcement. That's automation without humanity." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. A few of the Marines from the convoy had stepped forward, not threatening, just present. Their uniforms said everything Miller's badge hadn't. And then, as if Kane had pulled every invisible string in the city, a new sound joined the ambient hum of idling engines, sirens, then silence. A black, unmarked vehicle slid to a stop near the blockade, and out stepped the city's chief of police. His arrival wasn't an accident. Kane had made the calls. This wasn't a rogue mission, it was surgical intervention. The chief, a man with grey at his temples and the weariness of years on the job etched into his face, moved fast. He saw Kane, saw the formation of military vehicles, saw Officer Miller standing pale and still, and instantly understood the gravity of what had unfolded. Kane didn't wait for greetings. "Your officer was prepared to strip a Marine veteran of his last worldly possession over a parking violation. That veteran was actively working with the VA. No crime, no threat. Just a man trying to survive, and this city nearly pushed him past the point of no return." The chief looked at Miller, who shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. The silence was louder than any protest. The chief turned to Davy, nodded, and said with genuine weight, "I am deeply sorry, Sergeant Jones. You deserved better than this." But Kane wasn't finished. "I've spoken to the mayor. I've spoken to the director of the regional VA. Emergency housing assistance is already in motion. Outreach teams are on their way. And this department," he said, turning his gaze back to the chief, "is going to receive mandatory training on how to interact with veterans in distress, starting today, starting with this officer." Behind them, the tow truck that had been approaching slowed to a stop, clearly confused by the armored vehicles blocking the street and the gathering crowd. A few Marines calmly stepped into the road and motioned for the driver to hold. No one barked, no one brandished weapons, but the message was unmistakable. "You will not touch this van." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but a Marine sergeant stepped up beside him with quiet authority and said, "Sir, the generals requested that you remain here for a conversation with the chief." And that was that. Miller lowered his hand and said nothing more. General Kane then turned back to Davy, his expression softening, shifting from battlefield command to something far more personal. "You did the right thing, Marine. You held the line. Now let's get you what you've earned." He turned toward one of the Humvees and waved a signal. Within moments, a second vehicle rolled up with a VA outreach team, clipboard-carrying professionals, one of whom immediately began asking Davy for identification, contact numbers, service details. They moved with the efficiency of people who had seen too many situations like this and knew time mattered. But Kane wasn't just here to supervise. He stepped aside, pulled out his phone again, and made one more call. A private foundation he was part of, veteran-led, veteran-run, had an emergency fund, and he was activating it now. "We'll take care of the registration," he told Davy. "We'll pay the fees. We'll get the Wanderer legal again. But more importantly, you're going into housing today, a room, a real bed, a door that locks, and we're pushing your VA case to the top of the stack. Fast track. I won't allow another delay." Davy could hardly process it. He stood there, gripping the side of the van, trying to breathe. For so long, he had learned to expect rejection, bureaucracy, apologies with no follow-through. But now the weight of everything, the humiliation, the fear, the desperation, was beginning to lift. Not all at once, but piece by piece. He didn't have words. He didn't need to. Kane placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded. For the first time in years, Davy didn't feel like he had to explain himself. He didn't have to beg. He didn't have to justify why he had been sleeping in a van, why he couldn't afford registration, why his body shook on cold mornings. For the first time in a long time, someone with power didn't just notice, he acted, and not just someone, his general, his brother-in-arms, his commander. The same man he would have followed into battle now stood beside him in the middle of a city street, standing up for him, not just with words, but with muscle, machinery, and the full weight of respect. On that forgotten block, surrounded by quiet industry and weathered concrete, something rare happened. Not a confrontation, not a press event, a correction, a course adjustment. One man had nearly been erased by the system. Another had stepped in to say, "Not today, not on my watch." The transformation on Industrial Way didn't happen in an instant, but it was undeniable. Within the span of an hour, the forgotten dead-end street that rarely saw anything more exciting than delivery trucks and stray cats had become a stage for something extraordinary. A military convoy, a retired general, a humbled police department, and a weathered old man who had spent too long being invisible were now the center of a story the city couldn't ignore. And yet in the middle of all the commotion, Davy stood quiet, steady, processing the new reality being built around him. Brick by brick, word by word, act by act. The VA outreach team worked with quiet urgency. They weren't here to assess, they were here to solve. One staffer documented Davy's service record. Another reviewed his VA claim status and made a series of calls, pushing his file up the chain. A third handed him a warm coffee and explained with calm clarity that an extended stay hotel room had already been secured for him that very night, fully paid for by Kane's foundation. They would begin intake for long-term housing the next morning, and in the meantime he'd have access to a case manager, proper meals, and transportation support. No red tape, no lines, no check back next month. Just action, help, not delay. The van, the Wanderer, wasn't forgotten either. One of the convoy's mechanics, a stocky corporal with grease under his nails and calm hands, slid underneath the engine bay within minutes. Tools in hand, he ran diagnostics on the spot. It turned out the ignition coil was loose, and the battery was struggling, but nothing terminal. Within 20 minutes the engine coughed, then roared to life. A cheer, quiet but sincere, went up from the small crowd that had formed nearby. Workers from the nearby warehouses, a few neighbours who had wandered out to see the commotion, even a bus driver who'd pulled over just to watch. For once, Davy wasn't being stared at with suspicion. He was being seen with pride, with respect. The police chief returned from a second conversation with Kane looking serious and slightly shaken. He approached Davy directly this time, his voice low and respectful. "Sergeant Jones, on behalf of this city and this department, I want to apologize, sincerely, for how this was handled. No one who served this country should be treated that way. Not ever." His words were backed with action. Officer Miller had already been placed on administrative leave pending a full review. But it wouldn't stop there. The chief announced right then and there a new mandatory training program across the entire precinct focused specifically on veteran support and crisis intervention. Not a workshop, not a slide deck, real training, real change. Because what happened to Davy should never happen again. Kane watched quietly from a few steps away as Davy was handed his new hotel key, his documents, and a folder containing a fast-track application that would be personally overseen by the regional VA director. Once everything was squared away, he finally walked over, placed a hand on the van's hood, and said with a small smile, "She's got some fight left in her." Davy, his voice hoarse but warm, nodded. "Just like me," Kane chuckled. "I never doubted it." Later that evening, Davy sat across from the general in a small booth at the hotel's diner. Nothing fancy, laminated menus, vinyl seats, but to Davy it felt like 5 stars. He sipped hot soup while Kane drank black coffee, and for a few minutes they just talked. About the Corps, old friends, missions from decades past, and the strange loneliness that settles in when the world you gave everything to forgets your name. "You should have called sooner," Kane said at one point, gently but firmly. "You've always had that number for a reason." Davy looked down at his hands, then back up with a tired smile. "Didn't want to bother you, sir." Kane leaned forward slightly, voice low. "Davy, looking after our own is never a bother. It's the job. It's the only job that matters when the system forgets what loyalty really means." The story of the day's event spread quickly. The convoy, the general, the block street. Social media lit up with posts and pictures of olive-drab vehicles parked like sentinels around an aging camper van. Headlines began appearing online within hours. Retired general defends homeless vet from tow. Military convoy blocks street for forgotten hero. Justice rolls on 4 wheels. But beyond the noise and the spectacle, what lingered was something more lasting, the unspoken promise that real loyalty doesn't end with discharge papers. That service doesn't come with an expiration date. By morning, Davy Jones wasn't just a citation number. He was a name being passed around City Hall, Virginia offices, and newsrooms with a mixture of embarrassment and resolve. Embarrassment that it had come to this. Resolve that it wouldn't happen again. His van remained safely parked in the hotel lot, a guest like him. And for the first time in years, he woke up under a roof he didn't have to drive to or worry about being towed from. A shower, a hot breakfast, a day of appointments ahead, not to prove his worth, but to secure what he had already earned. And somewhere far off, a convoy rolled back to base. Its presence had been temporary, but its impact was permanent. Because that day proved something loud and clear. When the system forgets, when rules become walls instead of bridges, when good men are pushed to the edge without so much as a thank you. Real leaders bring the convoy, not for a show, not for applause, but because duty never ends, because no Marine gets left behind, not on the battlefield, not on the street, not ever.